Can you all hear me? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Winter Lecture Series at Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Chris. I'm one of the Rangers here. And as always, we want to thank you for making us part of your day. Before we begin, I would ask you to please silence your cell phones and electronic devices. And as a reminder, everything that we're doing this winter is all being filmed and is all available via the Gettysburg Foundation YouTube page. So if you missed this lecture or want to revisit one, that's all available to you via the Gettysburg Foundation YouTube. Also, and this is perhaps obvious, but the park and the visitor center will be closed tomorrow for the snowstorm. There will be no winter lecture. We are rescheduling the winter lecture to March 14th. But please have a safe Sunday, a warm Sunday. Dan and I are not going to be here tomorrow, so we'll see you the following weekend. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Codie Eash, Director of Education and Interpretation at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. Codie's been with Seminary Ridge since before the museum opened its doors, rising through the roles in visitor services, communications, and operations. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Communication and Journalism with a minor in history from Shippensburg University, and he's currently pursuing a master's degree in American history through Gettysburg College and the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Beyond his work at the museum, Codie is a widely respected historian. He presents regularly at Civil War roundtables, historical societies, and places like this in the National Park Service. He also contributes to publications like Civil War Monitor, Emerging Civil War, Gettysburg Magazine, and more. Codie brings his passion for Civil War era storytelling and public engagement to our series, enriching our collective understanding of the past through thoughtful interpretation, and it's an honor to have him here today. So please join me in welcoming Codie.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Chris. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new ones as well. As always, it's an honor to be here at Gettysburg National Military Park. I was just telling Chris a little earlier that when we were looking earlier in the week at the possible weather for this weekend that, fortunately for me is now not starting until tomorrow, for a moment I thought, oh, maybe this isn't meant to be, because I was supposed to speak, I think it was the exact same weekend in 2020 for a winter lecture. That got snowed out, which was rescheduled for March of 2020, which got COVIDed out. And then we were looking at the winter weather for this afternoon. But third time's a charm, and I'm really happy to be here. I've now also checked off all the bingo card slots for places to present here at Gettysburg National Military Park. I've now been in the National Park Amphitheater out by the Longstreet Memorial. I was at the National Cemetery Rostrum last summer. I've been in the Ford Room here for both the Gettysburg Foundation and for the park, and now finally here in the theater. And so really an honor to be part of this esteemed series. I've been in the audience many, many times for this and watched so many of these online, and a distinct pleasure to be here with you all. I do also just want to say that when I speak at any National Park Service sites, there's an especial honor that goes along with that. For this year especially, looking at the time in which we are living 250 years into the American Republic, it's a great opportunity to take a step back and remind ourselves of the special resource that we have in the National Park Service for its natural conservation, for its historic preservation, for its education for the public. And the National Park Service on any of these sites, whether it's at a nature park or at a historical site, a battlefield or a historic house, has always done the top-notch interpretation that we have available for the American public to make us really think about all of the complexities of American history, of what makes us us, of all of the beautiful things and the ugly things, of all of its complexities and niceties, of all of the heroes of the past and those unknown figures who we oftentimes forget about in these stories as well. And so anytime that I have the chance to take the stage and take the microphone at a National Park Service site, it really does allow me to take a step back and think, what would 10-year-old me have thought about the chance to do exactly what I get to do right now. And with us at Seminary Ridge Museum, we really enjoy having the chance to work with Gettysburg National Military Park and the nonprofit partner here at the Gettysburg Foundation. They are as good a community partner of a set of organizations as we could ever hope for, and really love doing all the programming that we do together and all of the projects that we've done in the past and those that we will continue to do here throughout this year and into the future. Now, how many of you have visited Seminary Ridge Museum before? See a lot of familiar faces here. For those who have not, I always like to start out by just contextualizing our site. We are just across town, a mile and change from where we are right now, on the campus of United Lutheran Seminary, as the institution is known today, in the original building in the middle of the campus, historically known by a few names as Schmucker Hall or Old Dorm, or simply known as the Seminary Building or the Seminary Edifice originally. The campus dates back to 1832, but the school itself started in Gettysburg 200 years ago this year in 1826. And so as we commemorate America 250, the Lutheran Seminary here at Gettysburg is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year as well. This is an important location historically. This is the oldest surviving Lutheran seminary anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. There are examples of a black student coming to the campus as early as 1835, Daniel Alexander Payne, an important piece of the story of African American education in U.S. history. This was the original building where students would have lived and learned, where faculty taught and staff resided, where the historic dining facilities were, the chapel, the library, the dorms, the classrooms. If you were coming to Gettysburg in the 19th century for a theological education, everything you needed was right here inside of this building. And of course, in June and July 1863, this building becomes especially famous, first for the use of its cupola, the structure there at the top of the building, most famously utilized by Brigadier General John Buford and some of his signal staff, including Aaron Jerome, a prominent signal officer. And then the building is going to be right at the epicenter of fighting throughout July 1st, 1863. For 2.5 months after the battle, it's going to serve as one of the battlefield's longest tenured military hospitals here at Gettysburg, treating soldiers of both the United States and the Confederate armies. If you have not visited Seminary Ridge Museum, basically how we split our museum is that we have 3 floors dedicated entirely to different topics surrounding the 19th century history of this building, the story of the first day of the battle, its impact in and around this building and the seminary campus. The 3rd floor is the story of battlefield medicine, especially focusing on this building and its surroundings and the military hospital that was there. And the 2nd floor focuses on those complex topics of race and religion, freedom and liberty, emancipation and slavery, and the debates surrounding those matters throughout the 19th century. You are able to go up to the cupola as well. We do have tours available year-round when we're open. This time of year presents a great view without the leaves on the trees, but of course it's not a particularly comfortable time to be up there. But if you haven't had the chance to see the view that General Buford had, I highly recommend you come over and visit us on Seminary Ridge. Now this afternoon, what we're going to focus on is this building and its surroundings and their history, not directly related to the Battle of Gettysburg, but what is happening in the 4.5 months after the battle. Then we're going to take a look at, of course, what's happening 4.5 months later on November 18th and 19th, 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln is here in Gettysburg. And we'll take a look at what Lincoln's plans were for the time that he's here in Gettysburg. And then we're going to kind of combine those two things. And we're going to take a look at what we know about the possibility of an excursion that Lincoln might have made to the ground around the seminary, as one source says. Now, it is worth noting that when we look at the vast historiography on the Gettysburg Address, there have easily been more books written about this one 272-word speech than just about any speech, certainly in American history, maybe in world history. Any one of the pages of a single one of these books probably has more words on it than Lincoln's actual speech. All of these books have certain through lines. Many of them take a look at why Lincoln wrote what he did, where did he get the inspiration that he did. Some of them take a look at exactly what he did while he was in Gettysburg. There are many, many things that scholars agree on that happened, but then there are some that are somewhat controversial as well. Not in the typical sense that we think of historical controversies, but just really based around that fact that many people who experienced these things remember them in entirely different ways. And there's this age-old debate over how many people were actually in attendance at the Gettysburg Address. Everyone there claims to have heard every word that Lincoln said, understood it clearly, realized immediately that it was going to be an internationally significant and historical speech. But then there are these other sort of lesser known controversial topics. And we're going to take a look at one of those today, which is this general question of where did Lincoln go the morning of November 19th, 1863? And did he visit the battlefield? Did he make a conscious effort to actually make some sort of an excursion, a trek around the battlefield to give himself a sense of place? Now, there are many esteemed scholars of Gettysburg and of Lincoln who don't think that these events actually happened the way that some of these historic figures believe that they did. I'll kind of give you a sense of where I land on these things as we go along. But what you're going to be presented with are a variety of different kinds of firsthand accounts, some written soon after the fact, some written well after the fact. And we'll see that there is some agreement among them, but also a lot of disagreement, of course, as well. And so you can kind of choose your own adventure, come to your own conclusion as we go along. But one thing that I really do want to focus on is what exactly is happening at this exact place where we might be able to put Lincoln on the morning of November 19th. So before we get to Lincoln himself, let's talk just a little bit about how the Battle of Gettysburg impacted the Lutheran Seminary. For those who may be unaware, the Lutheran Seminary is just about a mile west of the center of Gettysburg, the Diamond as it was known in 1863, or Lincoln Square with the traffic circle today, pick your shape. That's where the Lutheran Seminary is located, about a mile west of that. Series of north-south running ridges that make up the first day's battlefield. This is the last ridge that the Union First Corps holds on the afternoon of July 1st, 1863. This is a famous photograph taken by Matthew Brady around July 15th, 1863, so about 2 weeks after the battle. It's in contention for possibly the earliest known photo ever taken of the building. There's one other that has a circa July 12th date, and so if that is in fact an accurate date, this may be the second photo ever taken of the seminary. But this gives us as clear a sense of what that landscape looks like in the immediate aftermath of the battle as any depiction that we could conjure. The building is right at the middle of the first day's battlefield. As I mentioned, the Union line is backed right up to the other side from where we're looking. We're looking at the eastern or front side of the building from this perspective. The building is rather heavily damaged. A lot of bricks are completely destroyed. The northeast gable corner, which would be this piece here sort of behind the trees there, a bit obscured, had to be entirely replaced. We can see some areas where we can see that there are window panes that have been knocked out of the building. This is not damage to the cupola. It's a defect in the photographic plate, but there was damage to the cupola itself. And it's going to require some pretty extensive repairs, both inside and outside of the structure. Just to the left from our vantage point of this image, just off camera, is the home of Samuel Simon Schmucker, who was the seminary's founder and first president. We'll come back to him here in just a little while. And his home was hit by at least 13 artillery shells. And that's because, here we can see the first day's fighting. Here's the Lutheran Seminary with the Union line. By the end of July 1st, that's done a complete 180. Confederate forces have taken Seminary Ridge and the town, and Union forces are pushed back here to Cemetery Hill. Well, a lot of this Union artillery is firing toward Confederate guns around the seminary campus, and that's going to wreak a lot of havoc upon the buildings around the seminary itself. So even after fighting has passed beyond Seminary Ridge, it's still right in the middle of the high command of the Confederate Army. Lee's headquarters are just north of the seminary buildings across the Chambersburg Pike. There are dozens of Confederate cannon around the seminary buildings. There are a lot of wounded and dying and dead soldiers. And so even though the fighting has moved past the seminary campus after the first day of battle, easily you're going to be able to see the remnants of the fighting that would have taken place there. And this is a good image that we can see, one of 10 paintings that are at Seminary Ridge Museum that were commissioned and created by Dale Gowan, renowned military history artist. We can see on July 1st just how close the fighting came to the seminary building. Behind this hastily constructed barricade, a line of Federal soldiers, in this case the 151st Pennsylvania, they'll make their last stand. The building fills with wounded Union soldiers in the aftermath of the first day of the battle. And in the coming months, we're going to see this becomes a general hospital. Soldiers of both armies are brought to this location, not only for surgery, as we would see in a field hospital, but for long-term care and to recover from their wounds. And we know the names of about 500 patients who were treated in and around the building in the entirety of the seminary hospital. And so the battle has a definitive role in shaping the seminary campus and its aftermath of the battle. A couple of images here that we can see of, again, from that series of Gallen paintings. This is on the afternoon of July 1st. We can get a good idea of the hundreds of wounded patients who are there behind Confederate lines. And then inside the building, civilian aid organizations, ladies aid organizations are going to come out and aid those who are treated at the seminary hospital. So this is Samuel Schmucker here on the left-hand side. He was the seminary's founder and first president. He had established the school in 1826, and he'll still be the president of the seminary until 1864. He retires the year after the battle, and it's largely left to him and the seminary board to figure out how to deal with the aftermath of the battle. One of the things that they're going to have to deal with is that their campus, just like so many other places around this battlefield, are going to be vast sites of temporary burials of soldiers of both armies. And here's a zoomed in section of a map that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the S.G. Elliott burial map, Elliott being a civil engineer who gives us an indication of where soldiers of both armies, as well as in some cases horses, are buried on this battlefield. And the key would be any tally that has this cross through it, that's a Union grave, that's a soldier of the United States Army. And anywhere that is a tally that does not have the cross through it, that's a Confederate soldier burial. We know that there are about 79 patients who died in the seminary hospital, and we see nearly 80 of these hash marks on the seminary campus. So you can see how many of these patients are buried in the seminary grove along that line of Union breastworks. Here you see the one labeled Rebel breastworks. So we can see this is yet another sign of how much impact the battle has had upon the ground around the seminary. Now there's a student who comes back to the seminary campus in September 1863, and his name is Francis Hoover, and he talks about the fact that as he walks across the seminary campus, he tells his fiancée in this letter, "I can tell this was once a beautiful place, but it no longer is." He talks about how he can see the bones of horses sticking up from the ground. And then he gives us this great homespun description of these buildings. He says they all look like they've gone through a nutmeg grater. And so if you can imagine a jar of nutmeg in your pantry and look at the crumbling of that nutmeg, he says that's what all this brick dust looks like as it's laying all over the seminary buildings and the structures just west of the town. Schmucker files a damage claim. We can see that there are a couple of examples of appeals that are sent out through newspapers and sent out to graduates of both Pennsylvania College, or Gettysburg College as we know it today, as well as to seminary graduates of both of those institutions. Within about a year, the seminary and the college will independently raise enough funds so that by roughly late summer 1864, they're returning to some semblance of normalcy on these campuses. Now, on the back side of the seminary building today, if you were to visit it, there's a structure back here called the Peace Portico, but that's not dedicated until 1914. So when we think about what this landscape looks like in 1863, the building for the most part looks roughly similar to what it does today, but there are some pieces of the structure that are changed or added in the decades that followed. And here we can see is an excerpt from Schmucker's description of the damage claim here, where he talks about his house is perforated by 13 shells and cannonballs, several fissures made in the walls, window frames shattered, nearly all the glass destroyed. Up here he's talking about the building, the main building itself is struck by a number of shells and balls, several serious fractures caused, which will probably require part of a gable to be taken down. And that's the northeast corner of the building. So it's a pretty ravaged building as these things go. It's not entirely destroyed as a building would have been in a 20th century war. It's not crumbling to the ground, but it's pretty well damaged. And a lot of newspaper accounts talk about the number of windows that are shot out or have fallen out due to the concussion of artillery. So that's what's happening at the Lutheran Seminary. That's how that campus and the people who worked there and lived there, that's how they're dealing with the immediate aftermath of the battle. Now let's take a look at what's happening in Washington at the White House as those things are happening here in Gettysburg and at the campus of the seminary. On July 7th, 1863, so 4 days after the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, 3 days after the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi has fallen, President Lincoln is going to give some off-the-cuff remarks. There's a serenade at the White House, and he comes out and he gives this brief address. And I'm sure many of you have heard this before, but if you have not, pieces of this may sound a little familiar because it's sort of a dress rehearsal for another more famous speech. How long ago is it? Lincoln opens. 80 odd years since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. That was the birthday of the United States of America. And now on this 4th of July just passed, when we have a gigantic rebellion, at the bottom of which is an effort to overthrow the principle that all men are created equal, we have the surrender of a most powerful position and army on that very day. And in Pennsylvania, the cohorts of those who opposed the declaration that all men are created equal turned tail and ran. Gentlemen, this is a glorious theme and the occasion for a speech, but I am not prepared to make one worthy of the occasion. And of course, 4.5 months later, he would be prepared to deliver a more prepared oration, and we can see that this is essentially a rough draft of the Gettysburg Address that we will see here on this battlefield for the dedication of Soldiers National Cemetery. Lincoln is already thinking about what does this place, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, what does it mean, not just in this war, but in the broad spectrum of American history. And he's already tying this back to July 4th, 1776. It's also going to be within a day of this, the day earlier, on July 6th, 1863, that Lincoln probably reads these words in the New York Times, written by a correspondent, Samuel Wilkeson, who is, as many of you are familiar with this story, he is finding the location where his son, Bayard Wilkeson, had been killed, mortally wounded on Barlow's Knoll on the north side of Gettysburg. And Wilkeson writes this in part: "My pen is heavy. Oh, you dead, who at Gettysburg have baptized with your blood the second birth of freedom in America, how you are to be envied." And Harold Holzer and other Lincoln scholars have long pondered as Lincoln read those words, the second birth of freedom in America, and he will later perhaps massage that into the more famous new birth of freedom that he talks about here at Gettysburg. Now, would Lincoln have been aware of the Lutheran Seminary? This is when we can start to sort of combine these two places, or the person and the place, Lincoln and the Lutheran Seminary here at Gettysburg. The short answer is yes. Though he does not know the seminary by name, we see that throughout the Lincoln Papers and throughout the official records, sometimes in cipher, we can see that some of these messages are sent. There's a big controversy that develops the second week of July, so about a week after the battle. And it has everything to do with this man, Confederate Division Commander Isaac Trimble, wounded during Pickett's charge, taken to the home of Charles McCurdy on Chambersburg Street in Gettysburg to be treated. And as we start to see the buildings around Gettysburg, where especially private residences are concerned, they want to consolidate patients. They want to get them out of those private residences and get them into general hospitals, such as the Lutheran Seminary. And so we're going to see that Robert Schenck, who commands Union forces and is based in Baltimore, is going to send a message up the rank to Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, and he is going to send this message along to President Lincoln. And the long and short of it is that they are questioning, what exactly do we do with Isaac Trimble? Because we're sending most of these Confederate patients, after they're now prisoners of war, to Fort McHenry in Baltimore. But where was Isaac Trimble at the start of the American Civil War? He is heavily involved with militia forces in Baltimore, Maryland. And so he's sort of this interesting case where they don't want him to try to sneak his way out of imprisonment in Union hands in Baltimore. So it goes up the chain of command and back down, and as I mentioned, this is in cipher in many cases. They are that concerned with this as a major security issue. Ultimately, what they decide is that Trimble is going to stay at the seminary hospital under armed guard, under the command of the United States Army in the coming weeks, and then eventually he is going to be moved to Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And so Lincoln, though we don't see the name Lutheran Seminary or any reference to the seminary building included in any of these remarks, in these messages, he is certainly intimately aware with at least one of the patients who was treated at the seminary hospital. Now, what we're going to start to see, of course, here at Gettysburg, and this is sort of Gettysburg Cemetery 101, just so we're all on the same page, is that all of these soldiers who are dead around the battlefield, even those who have been temporarily interred, there's going to start to be a plan with locals like David Wills, state government, including Governor Andrew Curtin, and of course working with the federal government to create this national cemetery to deal with scenes such as this along this entire battlefield. Here's Governor Curtin on the left-hand side, his special agent in charge of this project, David Wills, a local attorney, on the right-hand side. And of course, it will be Wills who eventually sends the letter to President Lincoln asking him to give his few appropriate remarks to dedicate the cemetery here at Gettysburg behind the keynote speaker of the day, Edward Everett. It's a story that many of you, I'm sure, are intimately familiar with, but it fits right into this timeline that we're talking about. Now, this is going to provide this opportunity for new meaning for that place that we call Cemetery Hill. And of course, on some battlefields of the Civil War, such as at Antietam, the name Cemetery Hill is not given to that location until the aftermath of the battle, when the National Cemetery is located in the aftermath of the Civil War. But here at Gettysburg, Evergreen Cemetery and its famous gatehouse, featured in art, featured in photography in the aftermath of the battle, had already given its name to that hill. But now on the other half of the hill, we're going to see that David Wills, working with the man who designs the cemetery, William Saunders, are now going to give new meaning to this new national cemetery here on the Gettysburg battlefield. Here is William Saunders, a landscape architect who is the man behind the design of the cemetery, this semicircular design, which is segmented by state. This idea that there would eventually be a monument placed at the center of the United States Army dead, what we now know as Soldiers' National Monument, though that will come much later. The keystone, the cornerstone, dedicated in 1865, the full monument in 1869, but they're planning for a fall dedication for this national cemetery. This is the handwritten copy here from the Library of Congress of Wills's invitation to President Lincoln, asking him to deliver these few appropriate remarks behind the keynote speaker of the day, Edward Everett. Brief side note, I wasn't planning to talk about this, but the other day I was up at the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, and I came across a letter. I believe the soldier was from the 142nd Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. And he writes a letter home to his father, January 31st, 1865. And it's right after Edward Everett has died. Now, Edward Everett is more famous in the 19th century than he is today. Today, he's most famous to us for delivering the main address at the dedication of the National Cemetery. But he was a former vice presidential candidate, governor of Massachusetts, president of Harvard, extraordinarily accomplished figure. And this soldier in 1865, when he writes this letter home, says that his unit has just learned of the death of Edward Everett. And he says that the men in this regiment are so overcome by news of this death that they think that Edward Everett and his death would be the equivalent of losing 2 or 3 Union generals. And it gives you a sense of how this man, who is a footnote and to some degree sort of a punchline, when we talk about him saying he said in 2 hours, but Lincoln could say in 2 minutes at Gettysburg, but an extraordinarily important figure to the United States war effort in the 1860s. I thought that was just an interesting anecdote that gives us a sense of his significance. Now, on November 8th, as we get a little closer to Lincoln arriving here at Gettysburg, he'll sit for a couple of portraits in Alexander Gardner's studio in Washington, D.C., the Gettysburg portraits, as they're oftentimes called, just 11 days before he delivers the Gettysburg Address. It gives us as close of an indication of Lincoln's appearance in a studio portrait as we have to his time here at Gettysburg. This easily being the most famous image we've ever seen of Abraham Lincoln, and a slightly less famous image that is taken at that same sitting. And it's on this occasion that Noah Brooks, a Washington newspaper correspondent, will ask Lincoln how his address is going for here at Gettysburg, and Lincoln famously tells Brooks that it is short, 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 is how he phrases it. Now, how about at the Lutheran Seminary? Let's go back to the place, as we're just a couple of week and a half out from the dedication of the cemetery. Samuel Schmucker is going to write a letter to his son Beale, who lives in Easton, Pennsylvania, just on the eastern side of Pennsylvania. He writes this note on November 9th. Now, Schmucker, as a brief note of context, is an ardent anti-slavery advocate who, much like Lincoln, had previously been in favor of colonization, of freeing enslaved people, but not seeing a place for them in American society, instead sending them to Africa. But by the time we get to the eve of the Civil War, Schmucker is largely using the pulpit to preach in favor of abolition. And he'll start using the term universal abolition. And through a series of sermons and other writings, he's going to become a marked man. And in the United States in the 19th century, there are a lot of Lutherans here in Pennsylvania and in Maryland, but there are also a lot of German Lutherans in South Carolina. And so when Confederate forces take Seminary Ridge on July 1st, 1863, some of them are intimately aware of Samuel Schmucker, where he lived. And a few days earlier, Schmucker had received a call from a former student of his, George Deal, who informed Schmucker the Confederate Army may try to arrest him if they find him because of these feelings that he has on slavery, because of rumors that he's aiding freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. And so Schmucker is not in Gettysburg during the battle. And as a result of that, his house is ransacked. Soldiers from George Doles's Georgia Brigade are going to write in several of Schmucker's pamphlets and books and his Bible. They try to burn one of them on the outside of his home the day the Confederate soldiers are awaiting retreat. And so when Schmucker returns to Gettysburg, in addition to this battle damage, he also has all of this damage at his home. And he writes to his son Beale November 9th, telling him, "We are enjoying good health and looking forward with interest to the great opening consecration of the National Cemetery. We are beginning to get fixed in our house, yet, as the rebels and our own hospital took 4 of our beds and never returned them. Our ability to accommodate our friends is much abridged." So he's telling people, we would love to have you here for the dedication of the cemetery, but we can't really accommodate you. We're still dealing with the aftermath of the battle. Our home has been rather decimated. But he does mention the National Cemetery is about to open, and that's an important timetable for that. Now, how about Lincoln? What is his plan as he's about to approach Gettysburg? On November 17th, there's correspondence between Lincoln and his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. He tells Stanton, the plan between the two of them, Stanton tells Lincoln, I should say, is that they're going to leave Washington on November 19th, which is a Thursday, at 6 o'clock in the morning. They'd get to Baltimore by 8, then Gettysburg by noon, thus giving 2 hours, says Stanton, to view the ground before the dedication ceremonies commence. Then they would leave Gettysburg after the dedication of the cemetery at 6 p.m. and arrive back in Washington around midnight, thus, says Stanton, doing it all in one day. Lincoln replies to Stanton, and he says, "I do not like this arrangement. I do not wish to go so that by the slightest accident we fail entirely, and at the best, the whole to be a mere breathless running of the gauntlet." The great Lincoln line there. So he's telling Stanton, I don't think it's a good idea for us to do this all in one day. I want 2 hours to visit the field like you lay out, and I don't think that this is something we could do if we're going sun up to sun down, doing the entirety of this trip from Washington to Gettysburg back to Washington within one calendar day. Now on November 18th is when Lincoln is going to arrive in Gettysburg, but before he gets here, he's going to swap trains just a few miles east of us in southern York County at Hanover Junction. Despite what many people think, that is not Lincoln standing there. That's another gentleman believed to be Abdiel Eichelberger, who was captain of the railroad there. Scott Mingus, local historian from York County, who many of you might be familiar with, has done some great work on Hanover Junction. But this photo is likely taken as they're awaiting the arrival of Lincoln's train so that he can switch locomotives and make his way here for the tenure of the journey at Gettysburg. You can still see this site today. If you go on the York County Rail Trail, it looks almost exactly as it did in this photograph. There's a marker for Lincoln there today. And then he's going to arrive on the evening of November 18th here in Gettysburg at the train station on Carlisle Street, just north of the town's central diamond. He's going to walk down the street, and of course he'll stay at the home of David Wills, who had invited him. So we can get this sense of where Lincoln went. Here's the circle of the train station on the Elliott map, and then he's going to walk just a couple of blocks here to the southeast corner of the square, to the home of David Wills. And there are several seminary students who were there, people who are directly impacted by what happened on the ground at the Lutheran Seminary a few months earlier. And they give us some great ideas of what that evening was like. One of them is Michael Culver, who was actually a college student, but he spent some time at the seminary during the battle, was actually up in the cupola and watched the arrival of Confederate forces. He says that we were anxious to see and to hear the chief executive that evening, standing in the square. Junius Remensnyder is a seminary student, 22 years old, and he's a Southerner by birth. He's from Stanton, Virginia. And he was a veteran himself of the 131st Pennsylvania Infantry. He had served at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and has just left the Union service. 55 years later, in 1918, so a while after the fact, he would remember this, of standing outside the Wills house that night of November 18th. The house faced the central square, and when the students, of whom I was one, learned where the president was staying, the square was thronged and made painfully vocal with college cries. But the students were determined to see the president and have a speech for themselves. Loud and long-continued calls brought no response. At last, when our patience was almost exhausted, the president, who had been at dinner, which our turbulence had not permitted him to enjoy in peace, appeared upon the balcony. Now, this is one of those inconsistencies in people's recollections, is that there does not appear to have been a balcony at the Wills house. Others would say that he appeared in the doorway. Some would say that he appeared in the window. A lot of people agree that Lincoln certainly said something brief that evening, but they have inconsistencies in how they remember where this happened. But Remen Snyder continues. There was nothing particularly oratorical in Lincoln's speech, and nor did the students think it very complimentary after their tedious wait. So with a feeling of disappointment, and by no means being favorably impressed, we retired from the scene. But he says in hindsight, looking back 5.5 decades later, Lincoln had correctly sized the situation. It mattered very little what he said to our thoughtless student body that merely desired to have its curiosity gratified. He would save himself, and we with others could well wait for the morrow. So we have this great encapsulation of how excited these students are to see the president, how disappointed they are when he doesn't give them this great piece of oratory, but how much in hindsight they realize that, in fact, what Lincoln was really here at Gettysburg to say and to do, they would have to wait for the next day. And likewise, Henry Clay Holloway, who is a 25-year-old seminary student, graduated in 1863. His account is not published until the 100th anniversary. He must have written it before that, but it's not published until 1963 in the Gettysburg Times. He simply said in his recollection, that night we saw visions and dreamed dreams of what was in store for the next day. Meanwhile, at the Lutheran Seminary, this is a photograph on the left side taken around 1878 to 1882, somewhere in that range, from the seminary cupola looking southeast. This appears in the collections of the New York Public Library. We're looking towards Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill here in the distance. This view looks quite a bit different today to the southeast for anybody who's been up there. And in the seminary that night, we're going to see a correspondent from the Cincinnati Daily Commercial, from an Ohio newspaper. And just a few days later, on November 23rd, he is going to write about his experience being at the seminary. The hotels were filled and the private houses in the town also taken up. I was fortunate in securing quarters at the Theological Seminary, which is not more than half a mile west of the village, and from which Ridge, Reynolds, and Howard were driven on the first day, takes its name. The seminary was subsequently turned into a hospital for soldiers and was witness to as much misery, heroic endurance, and patient resignation as any building ever erected by man. Great line. He goes on to talk about how a Mr. Ziegler, who would be Emmanuel Ziegler, who's the caretaker of the seminary, along with his wife Mary, they have 5 children who lived in the home as well. He calls him an intelligent and patriotic man, and talks about how he tours around the seminary with Ziegler. And Ziegler is showing this correspondent. He says, "This is the place where I saw a Confederate colonel shoot down a wounded Union soldier." He talks about going to a location where they're awaiting the arrival of parents to come see their child, but their child has died by the time that they have finally gotten there. And he goes on after he hears all of these stories to say this. And to me, it's the greatest thing that's ever been written about the seminary building here at Gettysburg. 1,000 tales of war and its incidents, which history will not record, but which tradition may preserve, cluster around this building, and for all time to come will make it a celebrated spot for the pilgrim to the battleground. And one of those possible pilgrims, if you will, who might have come to this spot is perhaps President Lincoln the next morning. Now, on that morning of November 19th, this correspondent from the Cincinnati Daily Commercial takes it upon himself to go up into the cupola, and this is the description that he gives. I won't read the entirety of it, but it's pretty remarkable how much of that view is rather similar today. As he describes what he can see looking in all directions, we can still largely envision that exact same view now. There are some things that have changed because of tree coverage. He talks about actually being able to see Willoughby's Run as he looks to the west, which we certainly can't beyond McPherson Ridge today. He also talks about some things that are happening that morning. The large flag that is up on the southern end of the battlefield It's a really interesting account that gives us probably the earliest large description that we see of what that famous view that General Buford had a few months earlier, what it looked like on a clear day. Now, what about President Lincoln visiting the battlefield? What do we know? There are three accounts I'm going to share with you here. They each share something in common, which is that each of the people who these accounts purportedly came from were not the people who themselves recorded it. They are recorded by people who were around them. And so in some respects, whether it's an interview, whether it's an overheard conversation, whether it's a newspaper correspondent reporting on something, they're all technically firsthand accounts, but they're coming to us by someone who is recording what he himself had heard. And the first of these comes from the Washington Daily Morning Chronicle. And this is published November 21st, 1863. It's as contemporary as we can get. It's 2 days after the events at the National Cemetery. And the byline on this piece simply says J.H. Now, Michael Burlingame, who is an established Lincoln scholar, written several books on Abraham Lincoln, he believes, and not just at Gettysburg, but beyond that, that sometimes when we see J.H. as the byline in the Washington Daily Morning Chronicle, it matches up with places that John Hay had been, who was one of Lincoln's private secretaries. So there's a strong possibility that the person who recorded this is someone who was intimately aware with Lincoln and is right side by side with him. But regardless of who exactly J.H. is, he writes this interesting account of going to the home, or hearing about this story of someone going to the home of Robert Harper, who is a Gettysburg newspaper editor, and that's where William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, had been staying next to the Wills house the night of November 18th into the morning of the 19th. And the conversation goes on from there like this. By and by, says J.H., this is on the rostrum at the National Cemetery, for context, Governor David Todd of Ohio said he had called on Governor Seward but had not found him at the home. He also called on Mr. John Usher, who was the Secretary of the Interior. Yes, sir, said Seward. I visited the ground around the seminary this morning, and Mr. Lincoln joined in. And so the first indication that we have that Lincoln may have visited the battlefield after he has gone over the remarks that he wants to give here at Gettysburg with Seward, who is working with Lincoln on many, many occasions. The first inaugural is the most famous example where these two men work together on Lincoln's rhetoric. They're doing that same thing at Gettysburg, going over the speech. The first page of the address is written on Executive Mansion letterhead. The second page of the address is not. It seems as though Lincoln is finishing his address while he's here in Gettysburg, and he very well may have been inspired by actually visiting a piece of the field itself. And at least this account, this recollection, is that where they specifically went was the ground around the seminary. Now we'll talk in a moment about if that's the case, why might that have been the case? Why would that have been a location Lincoln was interested in visiting? But there are going to be others who report on this as well. So here, of course, we have Lincoln, and here is William Seward. And we just heard Seward's purported words as reported by the Washington Chronicle. It's worth noting as well in this great line of Lincoln humor that at the dedication were 3 Ohio governors. It was the former governor, the present governor, and the governor-elect, I believe. And Lincoln supposedly says to them, how many governors does Ohio have? It's a great Lincolnism. But there are 2 other accounts as well. One of them is William McDougall, who is the Canadian provincial secretary. He's visiting Washington with Lincoln. He's the basic equivalent to our Secretary of State. He remembers visiting the battlefield with Lincoln. We'll hear his account in just a moment. And William Tisdale, who was a guard on Lincoln's staff, and he's a cavalry officer from the 11th New York Cavalry. This is a great photograph taken about 2 weeks after the battle by Frederick Gutekunst, and it gives us a sense of that broader interpretation of the ground around the seminary. Here's the Chambersburg Pike. There you can see the Eastern Railroad cut there. There's the Carey Sheed's house, which still stands today. The Casper Dustman barn, which the foundation is in part still there today. The Mary Thompson house is just out of view behind those buildings. And then here, of course, is the main seminary building and the home of Dr. Charles Krauth, which is still out there today. One of my favorite photographs from the aftermath of the battle. And what did William McDougall remember? One of the important things about this account is that it comes to us from the reminiscence of his grandson. This was a story that Douglas McDougall said that his grandfather was fond of telling, was when he visited the United States and toured the battlefield at Gettysburg with Lincoln. So that's an important caveat here. This is not published until 1947, so we're nearly a century after these events. But this was his grandfather's recollection. In the morning after breakfast, the party mounted buckboards and were driven to the battlefield. It was basically a large form of a wagon. On the drive, Mr. Lincoln was solemn and absorbed. He drew out the manuscript of the speech prepared the night before and read it over twice, and then tore it up and threw it away with a dissatisfied air. He seemed disturbed when they reached the platform. There a large crowd assembled. Here we have one of the great myths of the Gettysburg Address. Right alongside, Lincoln wrote it on the train on the way to Gettysburg, is that he tore up his speech and he rewrote it, the entirety of it, right then and there, moments before he approaches the stand. Of course, neither of those things is true. It's been mythologized over time. It's one of those ways that we really love this concept of building up Lincoln and other heroic historic figures and say, look at their greatness. He was able to write those 272 words on a napkin on the train or minutes before he got up on the platform. But the interesting thing to me here is that McDougall's recollection, though not specific, does corroborate this idea that they visited the battlefield in some form and that Lincoln was solemn and absorbed. And we can certainly see that in many of the Lincoln accounts here at Gettysburg. The last of these is William Tisdale, who I mentioned is in the 11th New York Cavalry. Now, we don't have a date on his account, but I would venture to guess that it's not too long after the Civil War, because where it comes from is a great book called Tell Me of Lincoln, which is not published until the 21st century. William Stiple publishes it, I believe, in 2009. I think it came out for the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth. And it's a series of interviews that James Kelly, who was a sculptor and an artist, who here at Gettysburg sculpted the statue of John Buford out on McPherson Ridge and the bas-relief on the 6th New York Cavalry Monument. He sculpted as well. But he was a Lincoln scholar as well, and he interviews a lot of Union veterans as well. And one of the people he interviews is William Tisdale. And Tisdale remembered going over the ground on horseback with Lincoln. So there's another inconsistency. Was it a buckboard, a wagon, like McDougall remembered, or was it on horseback? But he says another place that they went. He went over the grounds to Pickett's Charge and different places. Debris of the fight were all around. Guns, dead horses. Why dead men were found 6 or 7 months later among the rocks and brush, rebels and our own men. Now, at first glance, we would say Pickett's Charge and the seminary, they're nowhere near each other. On another hand, you could say, well, without all of the buildings and the trees that now exist between the seminary and the fields of Pickett's Charge, the neighborhood that's out there today, that's not very far. You easily could have seen the fields of Pickett's Charge from the grounds of the seminary. Or perhaps he's thinking about the ride to the cemetery, going through town. When they're standing on Cemetery Hill, they're very near the fields of Pickett's Charge, and Cemetery Ridge are not terribly far away. But of course, here we see, just based on someone's memory, they're going through this experience with a lot of emotion for a brief moment, thinking about it years later. We don't oftentimes see a lot of specificity in how they remembered these things. But for the rest of his life, and here's the headline on an obituary for Tisdale, we can see that this was a mark of pride that he would wear with him, is that he served as Lincoln's guard, including here at Gettysburg. And we see this referenced in many of the accounts related to him. So those are the 3 accounts, brief though they are, that suggests to us there is some battlefield visit for Lincoln. Now let's take the idea that he does visit the ground around the seminary, as Seward supposedly refers to this. Why might he have been interested in visiting the Lutheran seminary? One suggestion, and in many ways this idea, this interpretation goes back to the work of Martin P. Johnson, who wrote a wonderful book in 2013 that won the Lincoln Prize at Gettysburg College called Writing the Gettysburg Address. And he developed this theory that perhaps it had something to do with the proximity of the Lutheran seminary to where John Reynolds, the Union First Corps left-wing commander, had been killed mere moments after his arrival. A month before the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln supposedly offers command of the Army of the Potomac to General Reynolds. They really never saw eye to eye politically. Reynolds is a Buchanan Democrat, a conservative Democrat. Doesn't really see much value in interpreting the movements of the Army through the politics of Washington, refuses command of the Army a month before the battle, as I mentioned. But we do see evidence of Lincoln's ongoing respect for Reynolds. up to and including a month after Lincoln is here at Gettysburg on December 23rd, 1863. One of Reynolds' aides, Charles Vail, who was with him when Reynolds was killed, he is in search of a promotion. And Ellen Reynolds, who was one of John Reynolds' sisters, writes to the War Department. She writes to Edwin Stanton and she asks if this could be a promotion for a gift, essentially, for the Reynolds family, to thank Charles Vail for his service, what he had done for General Reynolds. And Lincoln is going to say, please see this lady, who is a sister to our gallant and brave friend, General Reynolds, who fell at Gettysburg. Please oblige her if you can. And ultimately, Vail is going to be receive his promotion. So we can see, just a month after Lincoln's at Gettysburg, John Reynolds is still front of mind for him as far as his respect for this now fallen U.S. Army general. And this ground around where Reynolds had fallen, which is generally in the vicinity of the Lutheran Seminary, this is going to be a place that's well marked immediately after the battle. And there's always going to be this debate, where exactly did Reynolds fall? A tree with an R carved into it turns into the marker placed on the tree that we can see here, turns into eventually later the monument that's out there today at the approximate spot where John Reynolds was killed. It's easily a place where visitors, including the President of the United States, are very probably interested in visiting. And so that's a theory for why perhaps Lincoln would have visited that space. Now, with just the final few moments that I have here, I just want to give us a sense, what did this landscape look like when Lincoln visits there? I took these photos 2 or 3 years ago. I believe it was something like November 16th or 17th. So it's right around the time that Lincoln's there. The seminary grounds have more buildings today than were there in 1863, and actually have fewer trees there now than there were at the time, the opposite of what we usually see at Gettysburg and other battlefields. But this just gives us a general sense of what this campus would have looked like, whether Lincoln is definitively there or others who are visiting the seminary landscape. And here we can see, looking from Seminary Ridge to McPherson Ridge, here's Reynolds Woods or Herbst Woods, where John Reynolds is killed. We can't quite make out the monument, but it'd be right about in that general vicinity there. And then this is looking from the swale closer to the Reynolds death marker back toward the seminary with, of course, the main building, the museum building today, there in the distance. And so those are the locations that we can definitively say, Lincoln is at the center of town and down here at the National Cemetery, but did he perhaps make this trek as well over to the ground around the seminary? Now later in that J.H. account, he gives this great line, which has nothing directly to do with our topic at hand, but people get a kick out of this, is that J.H. says that, this is not the same line I thought that I had up here. He has this moment where he says that during Edward Everett's address, that some idiot in the crowd yells out 3 cheers for Edward Everett, and people start booing that man, and he says, Mr. Idiot subsided. But as they're waiting to go to the National Cemetery, is actually what is up on screen here, is this line where Lincoln apparently remarked upon the fair prospects spread out before him and observed that he had expected to see more woods. Now, if Lincoln visits the battlefield and says, I thought there would be more woods, how would he have had any idea of what tree coverage was like at Gettysburg? We have to keep in mind that the western side of Gettysburg is the most photographed place in the immediate aftermath of the battle. And so the battlefield landscape for a lot of people in their mind's eye is what the first day of the battlefield looks like. From the Mary Thompson House and Lee's headquarters, of course, owned and maintained by American Battlefield Trust today, the Lutheran Seminary with all the trees that are there. Here we are in McPherson Ridge, and this is the wood line where Reynolds fell. Here's the seminary cupola in the distance with all these trees. Here's this famous photo of the 3 Confederate prisoners in front of the Confederate barricade here built after the battle. We can see there are a lot of trees that make up all these images, and Lincoln undoubtedly is familiar with these photos. There are drawings like these in Harper's Weekly, where we can see that there are a lot of woods featured in them, including here the field where Reynolds fell is a prominently featured location. The Fall of Reynolds, this Alfred Wadd sketch, several versions of it have already made their way into the public, and so Lincoln is certainly familiar with those. So he has an intimate awareness, as anybody would have if they were familiar with what the battlefield looked like, that there seemed to be a lot of trees on the Gettysburg battlefield. And I'll just kind of end here with the of course, the trek to the National Cemetery, famous image looking up Baltimore Street in the procession there. This large group image right after likely Lincoln has just spoken. Here's the speaker's rostrum, this raised section in the back there with Lincoln with his hat off. Here's the zoomed in section of it. And there are several people from the Lutheran Seminary who were actually there at the dedication of the National Cemetery. Junius Remensnyder, who we heard from earlier, who was disappointed that Lincoln didn't say more the night before the address. Henry Eyster Jacobs, who writes an entire book on this. He's a student starting in the fall of 1863. The son of Michael Jacobs, who was the professor of mathematics and chemistry at the college. Michael Jacobs, who writes the first de facto book on the battle. More on that in just a moment. Henry Bauer, who was the president of Pennsylvania College, which has a founding history with the Lutheran Seminary, is there and delivers a prayer. Has a son who was killed at the Battle of Shiloh. And then this is James Allen Brown, who will succeed Samuel Schmucker. He'll be the second president of the Lutheran Seminary. He attended this ceremony with his son. He was himself at this point the chaplain of the U.S. Army General Hospital in York, Pennsylvania, just 30 miles to the east of us. Now, Henry Jacobs, the seminary student and son of Michael, who I mentioned, here's his book, Notes on the Rebel Invasion of Maryland and Pennsylvania, with this map. There are a couple of letters that he sends to the White House in October 1863, where he sent Lincoln a copy of this book. We don't see a response from Lincoln in the historical record, but it's very possible that it might have been because of this Pennsylvania College professor's work and this family connected with the Lutheran Seminary that Lincoln may have been familiar, generally speaking, with the story of what happened at Gettysburg and this great lauded map that is featured in Jacobs' work as well. Now, I want to end with this, is that when we take a look over the course of the past 250 years now, we're commemorating, of course, the semi-quincentennial of the United States founding in 1776. The Gettysburg Address and the story of Lincoln has everything to do with the legacy of the American Revolution. Lincoln directly calls that out, of course, in his speech at Gettysburg, 7 years ago, looking back from 1863 to 1776. And when we think of Abraham Lincoln, we always, of course, promote this big, larger-than-life figure. But I think that this is an extremely important thing for us to consider now, is recontextualizing, thinking about our big heroes of the past in new ways. And when we come to these big anniversaries like this is a great way for us to think about all of the scars and foibles and contradictions, as the man I'm about to quote from said. So I'm going to quote from two people to close this out, because I think that there are two really important themes that we can tie together here. One is thinking about the fullness of American history. W.E.B. Du Bois in 1922, it was the same summer as the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., he realized that across the United States, there seemed to be a lot of people who were really wanting to whitewash the image of Abraham Lincoln. They wanted to take away anything that made them feel uncomfortable about the story of slavery, about the story of Abraham Lincoln, and about the story of the Civil War's legacy. And he wrote this in part, and I think it's really important for us today as well. We love to think of the great as flawless. We yearn in our imperfection toward perfection. As a result of this, no sooner does a great man die than we begin to whitewash him. We seek to forget all that was small and mean and unpleasant and remember the fine and brave and good. This sort of falsehood appeals to some folk. They want to dream their heroes true. They want their heroes all heroic with no feet of clay. And they are astonished, angered, hurt if someone speaks the grim, forgotten truth. The scars and foibles and contradictions of the great do not diminish, but enhance the worth and meaning of their upward struggle. And then he says of Abraham Lincoln, thinking about the events of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, United States colored troops allowing now them to fight for the United States Army, looking at the words of the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln turning toward that idea of a new birth of freedom. And he says this, Du Bois does of Lincoln, in that curious human way, he was big inside, so that at the crisis, he was big enough to be inconsistent. He was a big, brave, inconsistent man. And I think big picture, when we think about the broad spectrum of our 250 years of American history, it's big, it's brave, and it's inconsistent. That's an important way for us to think about this. But I'm going to give the final word to a man who can combine this idea of the Lutheran Seminary and Lincoln here at Gettysburg, and that's Martin Luther Stover, whose papers are now in the collection of the Wentz Library on the campus of United Lutheran Seminary, who was himself a professor at Pennsylvania College. And he is going to provide the longest obituary or eulogy of anybody here at Gettysburg in the aftermath of Lincoln's death. This is published right after Lincoln dies in the Lutheran Quarterly. So he's reflecting upon his life as a Lutheran, Stover's life as a Lutheran, but also as being a member of this town where Lincoln visited just a couple of years earlier. He literally saw Lincoln walk these streets, and he's reflecting upon that. And I'll give the final word to him as far as how we can kind of combine all of this into our thinking. He says that Lincoln's name will be gratefully remembered in the archives of the country and the pages of history. His fame unimpaired will go brighter in the progress of ages and will exercise a power for good down to the end of time. Even in distant lands across the ocean where other cares engross and other names are cherished, the name of Abraham Lincoln will excite strange emotions of joy, enthusiasm, and veneration, the gratitude of all good men, and will be pronounced with affection by everyone in whose breast there shall arise an inspiration for human rights and human liberty. I hope this afternoon we've been able to take a new way of looking at Lincoln's time here in Gettysburg, a well-told story through the years. Hopefully there have been a couple different avenues, ways we can think about this, the people who were with him, maybe the places where he went, as we think about this in the context of the fullness of American history as well as we commemorate 250 years of our history this year. Thank you all so very much for being here. Do we have time for a couple questions, Curtis? Okay, yeah, happy to take a couple questions. Anybody? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed on the picture you showed on one of the first slides of the seminary, how thick the wood area was, which makes a lot more sense how they fought their way back to town through that. But what really impressed me, and even in this picture you have on here, was how much the fences were intact.
Yeah.
With all that going on, and breastworks being made, and firewood, and everything else. What's the explanation of that?
Yeah, if anybody didn't hear that, the question about all the fences around the seminary that appear to be intact, and this is not just an artistic interpretation. We can see that in a lot of photographs as well. Basically, what we see is the seminary has a ton of fences around it, as a lot of 19th century properties did, of course. And if you look at the ground right around the seminary, like this white fence we see here, we think surrounded a garden, and that appears to be, relatively speaking, intact. Now, the garden is where they actually buried some of the Union soldiers. So Robert Cummins, who was the 142nd Pennsylvania colonel, there's an account from one of the soldiers in his unit who talks about seeing Cummins buried in the garden. So the garden itself, pretty well destroyed, fertile soil there, but the fence line appears to stay intact. But if you take another step out from that, what we oftentimes will see in like the Frederick Gutekunst image or the Matthew Brady image is that where you have post and rail fences, as most of them are around the seminary property, the posts are intact, but the rails are not. And what I make of that is that in the building of a barricade, Abner Doubleday, First Corps commander, orders the construction of a barricade as a precautionary measure the afternoon of the first day of the battle, and men take down fence rails and low-hanging tree branches and stumps, etc. I think that probably explains why a lot of the rails are gone, as they're using those. But then if we look at some of the other photos, if we go out a step further, not just on the seminary property, but along the Chambersburg Pike, that's where we see larger sections of fences that are destroyed. And what I make of that is during the retreat, as those troops are running the gauntlet, as the saying oftentimes goes, they're probably taking down those fence lines so that they can retreat across the fields a little easier and to move artillery off the roads as well. But it's a great observation. Another interesting one is that I don't think I had the image in here, I could be wrong, but you can easily find it online. So Brady's photo that we did see from mid-July, there's still a lot of leaves on the trees for the most part, but then there's another photo that's dated in the historic source and by William Frazanito as circa August 1863, but the leaves are almost entirely gone. And so I've always understood this as either that photo could be misdated and it's actually that autumn, or are we seeing an example that this is in fact August of how much natural damage has been done to the battlefield landscape, that these trees are missing all their leaves because they've died because of being so shot. But yeah, the fences, the trees, it's interesting to look at these photos, and some places where you think it should be a little more damaged than it is, it's not. Good observation. Yeah, oh,
I've got two questions. One's fair and one's not fair.
Okay.
What would you prefer?
Let's go with not fair first. Yeah.
Okay. Don't blame me then.
Yep.
Weather forecasters say there's a 20% chance of rain or there's a 40% chance of rain. How percent certain are you that Lincoln was in that excursion by the seminary?
I'm gonna go with, I'll say I'm 75% certain. Now I think it's a broad enough, the ground around the seminary. Does that mean literally on the seminary campus? Does that mean to McPherson Ridge? Does that mean to the west side of town? I don't exactly know that. I can't say certainly that because no one says the seminary building or buildings. So I'll say that I'm 75% certain that they go somewhere on the west side of town. And one thing I didn't mention that is worth noting is that when you look at the descriptions for the Matthew Brady photo, for Alfred Wadd's sketches, almost anything that's remotely taken on the first day's battlefield says field where Reynolds fell, trees near where Reynolds fell. Regardless of which side of the seminary building you're on, even if we know today, visiting this battlefield as often as we all do, or living here or working here, we know, well, that's not really where Reynolds fell, it's half a mile away. But I think in their understanding, the ground around the seminary, it's probably a pretty broad, loose interpretation. So I'm gonna say that I am fairly certain that they take some excursion to the fields west of Gettysburg, is I guess how I would say that. There are enough people around and in the Lutheran seminary that it does kind of surprise me that none of them, whether it's students or correspondents, I think that they would have mentioned if Lincoln was literally at the seminary, like if he rode by, one of them probably would have noted that. But I'd say 75% that he goes somewhere in that general vicinity, the first day's battlefield, if you will. Yeah. And then what was your fair question? Yeah.
So how accessible would it have been, assuming they came out the Chambersburg Road and got to the seminary, to have just gone down the swale and gone out there to where Reynolds was killed? And then I'm going to add another question. How far south might they have been able to go past the Schultz house maybe to see the fields of Pickett's charge from,
I would have to imagine that to get from Seminary Ridge to McPherson Ridge, it's probably pretty easy to go right across that field. Even the Brady photo from McPherson Ridge in July, you can see that all the crops that are out there, they're all pretty well mowed down. So by November, when everything is harvested and dead, I have to imagine it's probably not too difficult to go directly out or to go out the Chambersburg pike because it's right there. You wouldn't have had to go too far south to see the fields of Pickett's charge.
Right where the light is?
Like probably right where the light is, yeah, down near the Schultz house at the intersection of Fairfield Road there. Dare I say, possibly even from the front lawn of the seminary. The trees are mostly right against the building or down the tan bark path, which is part of our walking trail today, which would be so this path here, if you were to go down that path, it continues, and all the trees are along it. If you go just south of that, I'm almost certain you can probably, you might be able on a clear day to see Cemetery Ridge from there.
You can look right across that.
Yeah.
Story farm.
Yeah, it's all pretty well open, and it's hard to fathom today. But yeah, when you look at period photos, there are a lot of tipped-in photos or other photographers from the cupola, which of course you're getting a 70-foot advantage there. But one thing that really jumps out to me looking southeast is just how open that was. And so I would say that from the ground level, you probably would have had to know what you were looking at to just a lay visitor. What's that?
I think you had a slide of it.
Yeah, there was that one somewhere back there. I don't know how far back I have to go, but yeah, long and short of it, I don't think you would have had to go very far to be able to see that. Maybe there we go. Yep. So here's there's nothing between here
So
and
that's all the town park and everything over there.
yeah, exactly. That's Long Lane, the hospital, Colt Park is all back there. Springs Avenue would sort of cut right through here. So that's Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge just to the right of that. So you wouldn't have had to go too far. Yep.
Can we come at it from the other way? It was clear from that one letter that Seward wrote that Lincoln wanted to go the day before to have more time available is there any evidence that he would have done something else that morning? It's clear he must have wanted to do something that morning.
Yeah, the plan, like I said, is to do it all on November 19th, and Lincoln wins the argument, and they come on the 18th, probably to open up this window that morning. It's hard for me to answer because I don't get an indication of any specific place on the field maybe that he wanted to go. And when you really think about it, if in fact he does go to the west side of town, he sees a good chunk of the first day's battlefield there, and then going through town and approaching Cemetery Hill and looking over Seminary Ridge, he's able to see a fair amount of the northern end of the battlefield, if you will. If he had any extra time, I'm sure he probably would have taken the opportunity. Bob and I were talking about earlier how much that Lincoln, when he goes to Antietam and on other fields, he's very interested in seeing these places, as much of them as he can. And this is a rare opportunity. We sometimes, I think, overestimate how many times Lincoln leaves Washington. It's only a handful of times. And he won't, this is another way to look at the aftermath of this. This is the last time that Lincoln gives a prepared speech outside of Washington until the following April of 1864. And so nearly a year later until he goes in that occasion to Baltimore. So when Lincoln visits somewhere, it's with a definitive purpose in mind. So I would have to imagine if he had more time, he would have liked to see more, but I can't definitively say where else that might have included.
There's no evidence that he had other appointments that morning to do other things.
Doesn't seem so, but they're meeting to line up by 11 or 11:30, I think, so late morning. And then that afternoon, he goes to the Presbyterian Church and sits with John Burns at a church service there. So he has some things planned throughout the day, but yeah, it's not chock full in the morning there.
No, but he had to go back and rewrite his speech, right?
Because he tore it up, yeah, exactly. He had to go back and rewrite everything. Yeah, somewhere in there is what he's finishing it, of course. Yeah.
Yes, several years ago, I saw Senator Edwards' dedication, and he spoke for about 2 hours, I believe. And if I'm not mistaken, he complimented Lincoln. He said that I wish I could have conveyed this in a short amount of time that Lincoln did.
Yeah. Everett sends a letter to Lincoln just a couple of days later and says, I should have come, I would pride myself if I could say I came as close to the meaning of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. I would say a brief note of support for Everett, like I did earlier, is that, in the moment, far more people were surprised by Lincoln's brevity than they were by Everett's length. That's what they're expecting, is the long speech. Without all the entertainment options we have today, people are seeking out those 2 hour plus addresses. Frederick Douglass comes to Gettysburg tomorrow, January 25th, 1869, and gives a 2.5 hour speech. People pay to go see that. So, but Everett realizes just how succinct and clear Lincoln certainly was. I'll take one more, and then I'll hang around if anybody wants to come up then.
You referenced the Elliott maps on your program here. Can you just expand more about those maps and where you find them?
Yeah, the Elliott maps. So you can easily find those if you go to loc.gov, Library of Congress website. Just go to the top. You can search. There's a drop-down menu. Select maps. Look up Elliott Gettysburg. 2 L's, 2 T's, and Elliott. And there are 2 versions of it there. There's the first version published in 1863, which is where I drew these from. And then there's another one in 1864, which he kind of colorizes the colors in the woods, and there are a couple of other annotations on them. And you can easily find those if you go to loc.gov. But he goes around the battlefield, does Elliott, that summer fall of 63, takes on that macabre but important task of logging where all of these burials were. And on the seminary campus, they do. We can see that there's evidence that all but one of those soldiers was reinterred, and that one soldier who was not reinterred, who they seem to have missed, they find his remains in 1907 on the seminary campus. The accounts differ as to what exactly they find, but it seems as though they at least find a piece of a coffin and a portion of a U.S. flag, and they'll take that over to the National Cemetery. But nearly 50 years after the battle, there was still one soldier there still on the seminary campus. I'll hang out. I'll still be up here if anybody wants to come up. We have some information on the museum. If you want a bookmark or a rack card, feel free, and I'll hang around if you have any questions. Thank you all again. Stay safe. Stay warm.